She carried the weight of a child on her back and a prayer in her chest. He hadn't spoken to a soul in years. But when she knocked, the silence cracked, and so did his heart. Before we dive deeper into this twisted story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy. The knock came just before dawn. It was brittle, desperate. 3 quick taps, then silence. Sergeant Ezekiel, Zeke, Washington didn't move at first. He sat hunched by the dying campfire, one boot off, one hand curled around a tin cup that had long gone cold. The fire had burned low during the night, and in its orange glow, the adobe shack looked like a place abandoned. But it wasn't. Zeke was very much alive, alone, silent, haunted, but alive. Another knock, then a voice. "Please, someone." He stood. The wooden floor creaked under his weight, boards familiar with the slow, stiff drag of a man who hadn't had company in years. The desert heat was already building, even before sunrise, promising another scorching day in the New Mexico territory. Zeke crossed the shack in a few heavy strides and unlatched the door, unsure why his chest suddenly felt tight. It wasn't fear. It wasn't hope. It was something else. Something like recognition, but twisted with ache. Outside stood a girl caked with dust and sweat. Dirt stained her faded calico dress, arms locked tight around something bundled in a threadbare blanket. She couldn't have been more than 13. Behind her, the desert stretched endless and unforgiving, waves of heat already shimmering above the scrub brush and cacti. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the air was already thick with the promise of brutal heat. The kind of heat that killed men and animals alike. "Are you the Buffalo Soldier?" she asked, her voice cracked from thirst. He said nothing, just stared. His dark skin was scarred from battles both recent and long past, his graying hair cropped short in military fashion despite having no uniform to wear anymore. I was told you lived here." "I'm Ruth," she said quickly, words tumbling out between labored breaths. "And this is Caleb, my little brother. He's 3. She adjusted the bundle in her arms, and from the folds of fabric emerged a pale, sleepy face streaked with dust and tears. The boy didn't cry. He just looked wide-eyed at the tall black man in the doorway, a man whose very presence seemed to command respect even in his isolation. "We got no one left," she whispered. "Mama passed last spring. Pa didn't come back from the cattle drive." Still, Zeke didn't speak. Ruth swallowed hard. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the desert sun. "This be our father." The words hit like thunder. Not loud, not sudden, but they cracked something old and buried inside him. Zeke stepped back, opened the door wide without a word, and Ruth stepped in. The shack swallowed her whole. She was small, smaller than any girl should have had to be, and the boy in her arms was limp with exhaustion and dehydration. Zeke shut the door against the rising heat, then turned. "Sit," he said finally, voice rough with disuse and the gravelly tone of a man who'd shouted orders across battlefields. Ruth obeyed. She sank into a rough-hewn chair beside the dying fire, clutching Caleb tighter. Zeke moved slow but with purpose, grabbing his water barrel and a clean tin cup. He poured slowly, watching the precious liquid fill the vessel. "Drink," he said, handing it to her. Ruth took it with both hands, her fingers trembling. She sipped first, then held the cup to Caleb's lips. The boy drank greedily, water running down his chin. "More," Zeke said, refilling the cup without being asked. They said nothing else for a long while. Caleb dozed fitfully in the relative coolness of the shack. The fire had died completely now, but the day's heat hadn't yet penetrated the thick adobe walls. Zeke watched the girl out of the corner of his eye. Her boots were men's boots, too big, stuffed with cloth. Her hands were raw and blistered. Her hair hung in dusty tangles around her face. But her spine stayed straight. She didn't slouch, didn't beg for pity. "You walked through the desert?" he asked at last. She nodded. "From Messiah." Zeke stiffened. That was 2 days' hard ride south, through some of the most unforgiving country in the territory. Too far for a girl her size, too far with a child in tow, especially in this heat. "Who told you I was here?" "A preacher at the trading post said you used to be a soldier." Said you once carried a wounded Mexican boy 10 miles to safety when everyone else said he was already dead. Said if anyone would take us, it'd be you. Zeke's jaw tightened. He stared at a spot on the wall where his old cavalry saber hung, tarnished but still sharp. I'm not that man anymore. Maybe you don't have to be, Ruth replied gently. Maybe just tonight, just long enough to keep Caleb cool and fed. He didn't answer, but he stood, moved to the old wooden crate that served as his pantry, and pulled out what little he had. Beans, hardtack, a precious jar of preserved peaches he'd been saving. Hungry? He asked. She nodded, the motion small but desperate. There wasn't much. Some dried beef, beans that needed soaking, water to stretch them. But he cooked in silence while she watched every move, eyes wide and unblinking. Not with fear, but with calculation. Ruth Morales was used to being in charge, of figuring things out, of staying alive. When the simple stew was ready, Zeke placed it in a chipped bowl and handed it to her. I'll eat later. She didn't protest, just took the bowl and set it carefully on her lap, then lifted a small spoon to Caleb's lips. He stirred, blinked, and took a bite. It was the first time Zeke saw Ruth smile. Later, after Caleb had eaten and fallen back to sleep on a pile of old army blankets, Ruth sat on the floor near where the fire had been. You don't talk much, she said quietly. No need. Sometimes need don't ask. Zeke almost smiled at that. Almost. She looked up at him. Do you believe in God? He didn't answer right away. I used to. Her voice didn't change. I still do. And just like that, the silence between them became something different. Not heavy, not distant, just shared. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the desert floor. Inside, a girl with too many burdens rocked her brother gently and stared at the cold ashes of the fire. And a man with too many ghosts watched her and remembered what it was like to protect something that needed him. The morning came blazing, light stabbing through the single window in white-hot shafts. The air inside the shack was still cool, but Zeke could hear the desert beginning to breathe with heat. Soon it would be unbearable to move, let alone work. He had maybe 2 hours before the sun turned everything into a furnace. Zeke Washington stirred first. His joints ached as they always did, not from cold but from old wounds and harder years. But something was different. For the first time in years, the air inside the shack wasn't hollow. He turned his head slowly. Ruth was still curled on the floor, her arms draped protectively around Caleb, her face slack in sleep. Her boots were off now, revealing feet that had walked too many miles on desert stone. Caleb, wrapped in army blankets, breathed softly, one hand fisted against his chest as if afraid someone might take the safety away. Zeke stood. The floor creaked under his step and the girl's eyes flickered open instantly. She didn't sit up, didn't startle, just watched him, silent and alert like a prairie animal. You sleep? He asked. A little, she replied. Boy slept more than me. Zeke nodded. Food'll be ready soon. She sat up, gently adjusting Caleb without waking him. Thank you. The words were small but real. And Zeke wasn't used to that. He wasn't used to a child thanking him like a grown woman. But Ruth Morales was no ordinary child. She looked at the world like it owed her nothing. And that, more than anything, told Zeke she'd earned her scars the hard way. Outside, the heat was already building to dangerous levels. Zeke pulled on his old cavalry hat and stepped into the furnace of dawn. The air hit him like a physical blow. He scanned the horizon. Nothing moved except heat waves dancing above the desert floor. He worked fast, checking his few chickens, breaking the skin of ice that had formed overnight in the water trough, splitting kindling for the evening fire. By the time he returned, the shack smelled of cornmeal and precious coffee. Ruth had somehow coaxed the dying coals back to life and was gently feeding Caleb while holding her own bowl in her lap. You made this? He asked, surprised. I watched you last night. He didn't know whether to be impressed or uneasy. Don't get used to it, he muttered. I don't get used to much. There it was again. That quiet defiance. Not rebellion, not sass, just truth spoken plain. Zeke didn't answer. He grabbed a bowl, filled it, and sat by the window where he could watch the desert. They ate in silence until Caleb said something. Bird, he mumbled, pointing toward the window. Ruth smiled. You see a bird, baby blue. Zeke stood slowly, peered through the dusty glass, and sure enough, a roadrunner darted between the sagebrush. Your brother don't talk much, he said. Shrugged. He used to talk more. Then Mama passed. Zeke didn't ask how. He didn't need to. Death was the only thing that lingered long enough in this desert to be familiar. He'll come around, Zeke said finally. You think so? If he's got the right soil to grow in. She looked at him then, really looked, as if weighing whether or not to believe him. He held her gaze. I don't know much about children, he added. I do. The room went still again, but this time Zeke didn't mind it. Around midday, when the heat had become a living thing that pressed against the walls, the sound of hooves broke the desert silence. Zeke dropped his cup and reached for the Winchester rifle leaning near the door. Stay inside, he said. Ruth obeyed instantly, scooping Caleb up and backing into the shadow of the corner. The hooves came slow, deliberate. Not panicked, not racing. A lone rider, maybe two. Zeke stepped outside, rifle held ready but not raised. The heat hit him like a forge blast. A figure emerged from the shimmering haze on horseback. Tall, weathered, wrapped in a dust-colored duster despite the heat. A white man with pale eyes and a badge catching the sunlight. He raised a hand in greeting. Peaceful, the man called. Just checking on folks. Zeke didn't lower the rifle. Name? Deputy Marshal Tom Bridges. Been making rounds through the territory. Zeke narrowed his eyes. You don't ride this far out by accident. Bridges gave a thin smile. That's true. But there's been reports of Apache moving through. Figured I'd check on the folks living alone. Zeke stepped off the small porch. Haven't seen any Apache. Good to hear. Bridges looked past him toward the shack. You got company? Zeke stiffened. Might. Bridges held up both hands. Ain't my business, soldier. I can see you know how to handle yourself. Not a soldier anymore. Buffalo soldier, though. I can tell. Seen enough of you boys to know the bearing. The marshal's tone carried respect. You served with the 10th Cavalry? Zeke nodded once. Good men. Tough fighters. Bridges turned his horse slightly. You need supplies or anything, there's a trading post at Copper Creek, about a day's ride north. They know you're out here. Obliged. Bridges touched his hat brim. You see any Apache sign, you fire 3 shots. I'll hear it. And then he was gone, disappearing back into the heat shimmer like a mirage. Zeke lowered the rifle slowly. Ruth stepped out, Caleb clinging to her skirt. Who was that? Deputy Marshal. Did he see us? Don't think so. She nodded, biting her lip. You think he'll talk? Maybe. Zeke didn't lie to children. Not ever. And Ruth wasn't the kind you coddled. What happens if he does? Zeke looked toward the desert, the heat waves making everything dance like spirits. Depends who's listening. That night, as the temperature finally began to drop and the desert came alive with the sounds of creatures seeking relief from the day's furnace, Ruth woke screaming. It wasn't a loud scream, just a strangled gasp as her body shot upright. She clawed at the blanket like she couldn't breathe. Zeke was beside her in seconds, one hand on her shoulder, the other on his knife, but there was no threat. Just her, trembling. I'm sorry, she choked. I didn't mean to. I didn't. You dreaming? He asked, voice low. She nodded. Tears cut tracks through the dust on her face. It's all right, he said. But she shook her head. I dream about the wagon wheel breaking. About Mama crying out when the fever took her. About Caleb asking for her after she was already in the ground. Zeke sat down slowly beside her on the hard-packed dirt floor. Dreams don't mean you're weak. I know, she whispered. But I hate them. He nodded once. You ever have dreams? She asked. I do. What of? He stared at the spot where the fire had been, eyes far away. Of boys in blue uniforms that called me sergeant. Of the woman who waited for me to come back from the war. Of battles that never should have been fought. She didn't ask what happened to the woman, and he didn't say. But in the silence that followed, something shifted. Ruth reached out, took his calloused hand with her small one, and held it just for a moment. Then she pulled back and lay down again, curling against Caleb, her breaths ragged but slowing. Zeke sat there long after she drifted off, listening to the desert night sounds and wondering if this strange, strong little girl had somehow managed to break into the last part of him that was still breathing. The next day dawned even hotter, if such a thing was possible. The sun rose like a malevolent eye, turning the sky white with heat before it was fully up. Even the lizards sought shade. Zeke rose before dawn as he always did, checking his water supply, feeding the chickens that somehow survived in this furnace, preparing for another day of endurance. When he returned to the shack with precious water and 2 eggs, Ruth had already swept the floor and was braiding her hair with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned to make order out of chaos. "You hunt?" she asked without turning around. "Trap," Zeke replied, hanging the water bucket on its peg. She glanced at the eggs in his basket. "That'll stretch to 3 if we're careful." Zeke grunted. "You always calculate like that?" She finally turned to him, face unreadable. "Always." He studied her for a moment. She had the weariness of someone much older, but also something harder, something forged not by age, but by necessity that didn't forgive mistakes. Zeke knew that look because he'd worn it himself through 3 wars. "Boy still asleep?" he asked. She nodded. "He had a good night." "Did you?" She hesitated. "Better than usual." That was all she offered and all he asked. They ate slowly, making the eggs last, Ruth feeding Caleb before herself as always. Zeke handed her a piece of dried apple, one of his last. She broke it in half without pause and gave the bigger piece to Caleb. Zeke watched her carefully. "You do that a lot." "What?" "Give the bigger piece." She looked down. "It's what Mama did." He nodded. "What would she say about all this? About you walking through the desert in summer?" Ruth paused for a long beat. "She'd say it wasn't smart. Then she'd ask if we were safe now. And if we said yes, she'd say, 'Then you did right.'" Zeke didn't smile, but he turned back to preparing for the day with something close to approval in his eyes. By midday, the heat had become unbearable. Even inside the thick adobe walls, the air shimmered. Ruth helped gather what little firewood could be found, her small hands working despite the burning sun. She worked without complaint, hauling mesquite branches like a ranch hand twice her age. "You ever lived anywhere but desert?" Zeke asked, stacking the precious fuel in shade. "No." "Then how'd you know to find me?" She hesitated. "The preacher said the old soldier lived alone past Copper Creek. Mama's friend, Rosa, she remembered the way from when she was a girl." "She tell you what kind of man I was?" "She said you were quiet, kept to yourself. But she also said you once fought 20 Apache to save a wagon train, even when you were outnumbered. She said you lost men that day, but you saved the women and children." The air around them seemed to crack then, not from heat, but something deeper. Ruth didn't look at him, didn't apologize. She just kept stacking wood. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered after a long silence. "Maybe not," she said. "But we did." That night, as the desert finally began to cool and the first stars appeared in the endless sky, Caleb began coughing. It started small, a dry, dusty sound, but by full dark it had grown into something deeper. Ruth sat up with him, holding his little frame against her chest, rocking gently by the small fire Zeke had lit for cooking. Zeke watched from his chair. "He's sick often?" "Only when the dust gets bad," she whispered. "Started after Mama died. He stopped eating for a while. Then the cough came." "He have fever?" "A little." Zeke stepped away and returned with a cloth soaked in cool water. Ruth took it without asking. She pressed it to Caleb's head while murmuring soft Spanish words into his ear. "We need honey," she said finally. "Or something to ease the cough." "Nearest supplies 3 days' ride," Zeke said. "Too far in this heat." "Then we make do." Zeke knelt slowly, reaching for a small tin box beneath his cot. He opened it, revealing old field medicine supplies, a few dried herbs, and a small bottle wrapped in cloth. "Willow bark tea," he said. "Mix it weak. Won't cure him, but it'll ease the lungs some." She took it with both hands. "Thank you." That night, the shack was restless. Caleb coughed through his dreams. Ruth stayed awake, rubbing his back with the patience of a mother 3 times her age. Zeke sat by the window, Winchester across his knees. Not because he expected trouble, but because trouble didn't always announce itself in the desert. Sometimes it came silent, like a sidewinder in the night. The next morning brought tracks. Not animal tracks. Boot prints in the sand near his water source, half blown away by the wind but still visible to eyes that knew how to read sign. One man, heavy, came close but didn't approach the shack directly. What? And more importantly, who? When he returned, Ruth was cleaning their few dishes with precious water. Caleb slept on the blankets, his breathing easier. Someone was watching, Zeke said simply. Ruth didn't flinch. You think they'll come back? If they're smart, no. And if they're not? Then I'll be ready. That afternoon, while Caleb napped in the coolest corner of the shack, Ruth found the photograph. It was tucked in Zeke's old campaign chest, buried beneath folded uniforms and a tarnished medal. The frame was silver, dented. The glass cracked, but the image was clear enough. A beautiful woman with kind eyes and careful hair, standing beside a younger Zeke in his cavalry uniform. They both smiled, his arm around her waist, her hand on his chest. She held it in her lap until Zeke came in, shaking dust from his hat. You still have this? She said quietly. He froze, seeing the photograph in her small hands. Why? Zeke crossed the small space, took the frame gently from her, and stared at it for a long time. Because forgetting her didn't work, he said finally. She didn't say sorry, didn't offer empty words. She just nodded as if understanding something that didn't need explaining. What happened to her? Zeke was quiet for so long Ruth thought he wouldn't answer. Then, barely above a whisper, she waited 2 years for me to come home from the Indian Wars. When I finally did, I wasn't the same man she'd said goodbye to. Did she leave? No. I did. Night came with an unnatural stillness. No wind, no animal sounds. Even the coyotes were quiet. Caleb's cough had eased with the willow bark tea, and Ruth finally slept soundly, her breathing deep and even. Zeke sat near the dying fire, the photograph resting on the wooden crate beside him. Outside, the desert held its breath. And far down the old cattle trail, a man with pale eyes and a badge made camp, his coffee growing cold as he watched the distant glow of firelight and planned his return visit. The man with the badge wasn't alone. Deputy Marshal Tom Bridges had been joined by 2 others, men with harder faces and no official standing. They camped a mile south of Zeke's shack, their fire hidden in a wash where the light wouldn't carry. The conversation was brief and businesslike. You sure about this? Asked the first man, a lean coyote of a fellow with silver hair and quick hands. Sure enough, Bridges replied, adjusting his gun belt. Girl's got a bounty on her. $500, dead or alive. What's she done? Killed a man down in Messiah. Shopkeeper tried to take liberties. She put a kitchen knife in his belly. The third man, younger but meaner looking, spat into the fire. Seems like justice to me. Justice don't pay bounties, Colt, Bridges said. And the shopkeeper's brother is the territorial judge. He wants the girl and he's willing to pay for her. What about the Buffalo Soldier? Bridges shrugged. Collateral damage. Man's been alone too long anyway. Probably do him a favor. They planned to move at dawn, when the heat would keep their prey inside and slow to react. Back at the shack, Zeke felt the wrongness before he could name it. Years of frontier life had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. The air felt different, not weather, but intent. He moved quietly around the small space, checking the loads in his Winchester, his Colt .45, and the old scattergun he kept for close work. Ruth stirred as he moved. Something wrong? Maybe. You remember what I taught you yesterday about the rifle? She sat up, instantly alert. Yes. But keep it close. Are they coming? I don't know. But if they do, you take Caleb and get under the floor. There's a crawl space that leads to the root cellar. You stay there no matter what you hear. Her eyes were wide but steady. What if something happens to you? Then you wait one day. If I don't come for you, you take what water you can carry and head north to Copper Creek. Tell them Sergeant Washington sent you." She nodded once. "I understand." Zeke looked at her, really looked. This child who'd walked through hell to find safety, who'd knocked on his door with nothing but hope and stubbornness, who'd somehow managed to crack open the shell he'd built around his heart. "Ruth," he said quietly. "Yes. You did right coming here." The first shot came with the dawn, shattering the morning stillness like breaking glass. Zeke had been waiting, positioned at the window with the Winchester, when he saw movement among the sagebrush. He didn't hesitate. In the desert, hesitation meant death. His bullet took the first man high in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him behind a boulder. The return fire came immediately, 3 rifles sending bullets through the adobe walls, filling the air with dust and flying chips of clay. "Stay down," Zeke shouted to Ruth, who had already grabbed Caleb and rolled toward the trapdoor. He levered another round and fired at a muzzle flash, rewarded by a curse and the sound of someone scrambling for new cover. The attackers had positioned themselves in a rough triangle around the shack, professional work that meant this wasn't random. A voice called out, carrying across the desert air, "Washington, we just want the girl." Zeke didn't answer. He was counting muzzle flashes, calculating angles, reading the fight like he'd been taught in a dozen battles against Apache and outlaws. "She's wanted for murder," the voice continued. "You hand her over, you can walk away from this." That confirmed what Zeke had suspected. This wasn't about him, it was about Ruth. Whatever had happened in Mesilla, it had followed her here. He fired again, this time at a shadow moving between the rocks. The shadow dropped and didn't move again. "Last chance, soldier." Zeke's answer was another shot, this one close enough to make the speaker dive for cover. The return volley was immediate and vicious, bullets punching through the walls, shattering his few possessions, filling the air with lethal fragments. When the shooting stopped, Zeke could hear Caleb crying somewhere below the floor. Ruth's voice, soft and soothing, trying to keep him quiet. The sound filled him with a cold rage he hadn't felt since the war. He reloaded the Winchester with practice speed, then moved to a different window. The attackers would expect him to stay in place, fire from the same position. Amateur mistake. The next exchange was brief but decisive. Zeke put 2 rounds through a man trying to flank around the chicken coop, dropping him in the open where he wouldn't get up again. The third attacker, the one who'd been doing the talking, broke cover and rushed the shack, firing as he came. Zeke met him at the door with the scattergun. The range was less than 10 feet. It was over quickly. In the sudden silence that followed, Zeke could hear nothing but his own heartbeat and Caleb's muffled sobs below the floor. He waited, listening, watching for movement that didn't come. Finally, he called out softly, "It's done." The trapdoor opened slowly, and she emerged with Caleb in her arms, both of them pale and shaking but unhurt. "Are they all dead?" she asked quietly. "Yes." She looked around at the bullet holes, the shattered pottery, the blood on the doorframe. "Was it about me?" "I think so." She closed her eyes, and for the first time since he'd known her, Ruth looked like the 13-year-old child she really was. "I killed a man in Mesilla. Want to tell me about it?" She sat heavily in the one chair that hadn't been shot to pieces, Caleb still clinging to her. "His name was Morrison. He owned the general store. When Mama died, we had nothing. I went to him, begged him to let us work for food. Zeke said nothing, just listened. He said he'd help. But when I brought Caleb to the store, Morrison locked the door. He said I could work upstairs, but Caleb had to stay in the storeroom." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I knew what he meant." "So you killed him?" "I grabbed a knife from his counter. When he tried to grab me, I didn't mean to kill him. Just stop him. But he fell wrong and the knife." She shuddered. There was so much blood. Zeke knelt beside her chair. "You did what you had to do. His brother's the territorial judge. Posted a bounty. Said I was a murderess. You're not." She looked at him with eyes too old for her face. "How can you know that?" "Because I've seen murderers. Real ones. And you're not one." By midday, Zeke had dragged the 3 bodies into the desert, far enough from the shack that the scavengers wouldn't be a problem. He'd gone through their pockets first, found the wanted poster with Ruth's name and description, along with a letter from someone named Morrison promising payment for her capture. When he returned, Ruth had swept up the broken pottery and was patching bullet holes with adobe mud and straw. Caleb helped by bringing her small stones, his coughing fit forgotten in the excitement. "You don't have to clean up my mess," Zeke said. "It's not just your mess anymore." He watched her work for a moment. "That bounty's still out there. More men will come." "I know. We could run. Head west to California, or north to Colorado territory." She stopped working and looked at him. "We." He realized what he'd said, and for a moment felt exposed, vulnerable. Then he nodded. "We. Why?" He thought about that, about the photograph in his chest, about the years of solitude, about the sound of Caleb's laughter and Ruth's quiet strength. "Because you knocked on my door," he said simply. "And I answered." That night they planned. Not just for the next bounty hunters, but for what came after. Zeke had money saved, army pay and bounties from his days hunting outlaws. Enough for a fresh start somewhere the Morrison name carried no weight. "Where would we go?" Ruth asked, Caleb asleep in her arms. "I hear Oregon's good country. Fertile land, not too many questions asked about a man's past. Or a girl's. Or a girl's." She was quiet for a long time. "You do that? Leave everything for us?" Zeke looked around the bullet-scarred shack, at the few possessions he'd accumulated in his years of exile. "There's nothing here but ghosts anyway." "What about her?" Ruth nodded toward the chest where he kept the photograph. "She told me once that the best memorial for the dead is to keep living. Took me 20 years to understand what she meant." Ruth reached across and took his hand. "When do we leave?" "Soon as we can pack." They were gone before the next dawn, riding north through country that blazed with heat even before the sun was fully up. Zeke had 2 horses, his own cavalry mount, a tough bay gelding named Sherman, and an old mare he'd kept for packing supplies. Ruth rode the mare with Caleb in front of her, while Zeke led on Sherman, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. They traveled by night when possible, holing up during the day in whatever shade they could find. Water was precious, food more so. But they made good time, pushing hard to put distance between themselves and anyone who might be tracking them. On the 3rd night, they reached Copper Creek. The trading post was run by a German immigrant named Klaus who asked no questions and accepted Zeke's gold without comment. They resupplied, bought a proper saddle for Ruth, and got news of the trail ahead. "Apache been quiet lately," Klaus told them in his thick accent. "But watch for rustlers between here and Santa Fe. Bad men, they shoot first." They pushed on, following old cattle trails and military roads that Zeke knew from his army days. The country began to change as they climbed out of the desert, more trees, better grass, cooler air that didn't try to kill you just for breathing it. Caleb began to talk more as they traveled. Simple words at first, horse, and water, and Ruth, but gradually more. He seemed to understand they were going somewhere safe, somewhere new. Sometimes he would point at things and look to Zeke for the name, and Zeke would tell him, patient as granite. Ruth bloomed too in small ways. She laughed when Caleb tried to pet a curious prairie dog. She sang softly as they rode, old Spanish songs her mother had taught her. The constant vigilance that had marked her began to ease, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. They were 10 days out from Copper Creek when they met the wagon train. It was a small group, 3 families heading west with everything they owned loaded into canvas-covered wagons. When they saw Zeke, some of the men reached for their guns, but the wagon master, a grizzled old-timer named Patterson, waved them down. "You're the Buffalo Soldier from down south?" Patterson said. It wasn't a question. Zeke replied carefully. "Heard good things about you." "Fairman," they said. "Straight shooter." Ruth tensed beside him, but Zeke's posture remained relaxed. Patterson's eyes moved to her and Caleb, taking in their travel-worn appearance, the way Ruth's hand instinctively moved to shield her brother. "These yours?" Patterson asked. "They are now," Zeke replied, his voice carrying quiet authority. Patterson nodded slowly. "We could use another gun. Country ahead's been restless, reports of rustlers hitting lone travelers. You willing to ride with us to Santa Fe?" Zeke considered. traveling with the wagon train would mean safety in numbers, but also questions, scrutiny, the risk that someone might recognize Ruth from the wanted posters. But the alternative was crossing dangerous territory alone with 2 children. "What's the pay?" he asked. "Full shares of whatever we make it through with. Plus we feed you and yours." Ruth looked up at him, her eyes asking the question she couldn't voice. Zeke made the decision. "We'll ride with you." The wagon train changed everything. Suddenly Ruth and Caleb weren't alone with a taciturn ex-soldier in the desert. They were part of a community, however temporary. The other families were curious but not intrusive. The women took to Ruth immediately, teaching her trail cooking and mending. The children, starved for playmates, drew Caleb into their games with gentle persistence. Mrs. Patterson, the wagon master's wife, was particularly kind. She was a grandmother many times over, with soft hands and patient eyes that had seen enough hardship to recognize it in others. "That girl's been carrying too much weight," she told Zeke one evening as they watched Ruth help prepare the communal supper. "Child that age should be learning to read and sew, not raising a baby brother." "She's stronger than most grown folks I've known," Zeke replied. "Strong's good. But strong ain't everything. She needs to remember how to be young." As if summoned by their conversation, Ruth approached with a plate of beans and cornbread. "Mr. Washington, Mrs. Patterson says you rode with the cavalry for 15 years. "Closer to 20, he corrected. "Did you ever fight Comanches?" Mrs. Patterson clucked her tongue. "Ruth, honey, that's not proper dinner conversation." But Zeke studied the girl's face. She wasn't asking out of idle curiosity, there was something more urgent in her question. "I did," he said simply. "Why?" Ruth glanced around, making sure Caleb was safely occupied with the other children. "Because I think we're being followed." The words hit like a physical blow. Zeke's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. "How long?" 2 days. Maybe 3. "I see dust sometimes, way back on our trail. Not enough for travelers, not regular enough for wind." Mrs. Patterson's face had gone pale. "You sure, child?" "I'm sure." Zeke stood immediately. "Patterson needs to know." The wagon master took the news grimly. He called a meeting of the men, and they huddled around the evening fire, voices low and tense. "Could be anybody," said Miller, a farmer from Kansas with soft hands and worried eyes. "Rustlers, bandits, maybe even Apache." "Apache don't follow wagon trains for days without attacking," Patterson said. "And rustlers would have hit us by now. This is something else." All eyes turned to Zeke. He knew they were thinking the same thing. The trouble had started when he joined them. "It's about the girl," Zeke said quietly. "There's a bounty on her. $500. The silence that followed was heavy with calculation. $500 was more than most of these families had seen at one time in their lives. Finally, Patterson spoke. "What did she do?" "Killed a man who was trying to hurt her. Judge back in New Mexico wants her for it." "She tell you this?" "She did." Patterson studied Ruth, who sat across the fire helping Caleb with his supper, unaware that her fate was being discussed. "Hell," he muttered. "She's just a baby herself." "Baby or not, $500 is $500, said Thompson, a lean man with calculating eyes. "Maybe we should consider." "Consider what?" Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Selling a child to bounty hunters?" "I raised you better than that, Samuel Thompson." Thompson flushed but didn't back down. "I got 3 children of my own to think about, Martha. If there's men following us because of her—" "Then we deal with the men," Zeke interrupted. "Not the girl." "Easy enough to say," Thompson shot back. "But you're not risking your family's lives." The argument might have escalated, but Patterson raised his hand. "Enough. We took them in, we see it through. Anybody who's got a problem with that can leave the train." No one moved, but the tension remained thick as smoke. That night, Zeke doubled the watch and positioned himself where he could see the back trail. Ruth joined him, moving silently through the darkness. "They're arguing about me," she said. It wasn't a question. "Some are. Maybe I should go. Take Caleb and—" "No." His voice was firm. "We stay together. All three of us. She was quiet for a long moment. You really think there's men following us? I know there are. Question is how many and how close. As if in answer to his words, a coyote howled in the distance. Then another. And another. But Zeke had spent too many years on the frontier not to recognize the difference between real coyotes and men imitating them. Wake Patterson, he told Ruth quietly. Tell him they're here. The attack came just before dawn, when the camp was stirring but not yet fully awake. Zeke had positioned the wagons in a defensive circle the night before, despite grumbling from some of the travelers who thought it was unnecessary. Now, as muzzle flashes erupted from the rocks above their camp, everyone understood why. Stay down, Patterson shouted, rolling out of his bedroll with a rifle in his hands. Return fire. The bounty hunters had chosen their position well, high ground with good cover, commanding the entire camp. But they'd made one mistake. They'd assumed they were dealing with farmers and shopkeepers, not veterans of Indian wars. Zeke and Patterson coordinated the defense with silent efficiency, directing fire to keep the attackers pinned while the women and children took shelter under the wagons. Ruth crouched in the dirt with Caleb pressed against her chest, her eyes wide but steady. How many? Patterson called out during a lull in the shooting. 6, maybe 7, Zeke replied, levering a fresh round into his Winchester. Same bunch that hit my place, plus reinforcements. They want the girl alive? Bounty's the same either way. Patterson cursed. Thompson, Miller, keep them busy. Washington, you and me are going hunting. It was a risky move, leaving the wagons to attack uphill against entrenched positions. But Zeke had learned long ago that sometimes the bold move was the only move that worked. They worked their way up the rocky slope, using what cover they could find. The bounty hunters were focused on the wagons, laying down steady fire to keep the travelers pinned. They didn't see the two men flanking them until it was too late. The fight was brief but vicious. Close-range work with rifles and pistols, the kind of fighting that left men either dead or scarred for life. When the smoke cleared, 3 bounty hunters lay still among the rocks. The others had fled, but not before Zeke put a bullet in one man's shoulder that would slow him down for weeks. Back at the wagons, they counted their blessings. 1 man wounded, Miller had taken a bullet through his hand, but no one killed. The children were shaken but unhurt, clustered around their mothers like chicks around hens. Ruth emerged from under the lead wagon, still carrying Caleb, her face streaked with dust and tears. Is it over? She asked. For now, Zeke replied. But they'll be back with more men. Patterson wiped blood from a graze on his cheek. How long before word gets back to whoever's paying the bounty? Week, maybe 2. Depends how far they have to ride. Then we'd better put some distance behind us. They broke camp within the hour, pushing the teams harder than was wise in their urgency to reach Santa Fe. The landscape began to change as they climbed into the mountains, pine trees replacing sagebrush, cool air that carried the scent of snow from the high peaks. On their 3rd day after the attack, they met another traveler on the trail. A priest, riding a gentle mule and leading a pack horse loaded with books and supplies. Father Miguel was heading south to establish a mission, but he was happy to share their fire and news from the outside world. There's been talk in Santa Fe, he told them over coffee that night. Something about a reward for information on a girl traveling with a Negro soldier. Big money, they say. Ruth went very still beside the fire. Zeke felt the eyes of every adult in the camp turn toward them. What kind of talk? Patterson asked carefully. The kind that makes honest men do dishonest things, the priest replied sadly. I heard 2 men in a cantina planning to ride south, said they had a sure thing if they could find the right trail. How many men? Zeke asked. Hard to say. But the cantina was full, and they weren't the only ones listening. That night, after the priest had rolled up in his blankets and the camp had settled into uneasy sleep, Patterson approached Zeke's position on watch. This can't go on, he said quietly. Every town between here and California is going to be crawling with bounty hunters. I know. What are you going to do? Zeke stared out into the darkness, where the silhouettes of pine trees swayed in the mountain wind. I'm going to end it. How? By going back. Patterson stared at him. That's suicide. Maybe, but it's the only way Ruth and Caleb get to live free. There's got to be another way. Zeke shook his head. The judge who put up the bounty, he's the dead man's brother. This isn't about justice, it's about revenge. Long as he's alive and wants her dead, she'll never be safe. You can't kill a territorial judge. I can't let him kill a child either. The next morning brought a decision that changed everything. Ruth announced that she was going with him. No, Zeke said flatly. You and Caleb go on with the wagon train. Patterson will see you safe to California. And then what? Hide for the rest of our lives? Change our names and hope nobody recognizes us. Ruth's voice was steady, but her hands shook slightly. That's not living, Mr. Washington. That's just slower dying. Better than fast dying. Maybe, but I won't let you go back alone. Not after everything you've done for us. Mrs. Patterson had been listening from beside the cook fire. Now she approached, wiping her hands on her apron. Child's got a point, she said. Running never solved anything permanent. This isn't about running, Zeke protested. It's about keeping them alive. And what happens when you don't come back? Ruth asked quietly. What happens to Caleb then? What happens to me? The question hung in the air like smoke. Zeke had no answer because there was no good answer. If he died trying to end this, Ruth and Caleb would be alone again, still hunted, still in danger. There might be another way, Father Miguel said quietly. He'd been listening from his bedroll, and now he sat up, his kind face thoughtful in the morning light. All eyes turned to him. I know Judge Morrison, the priest continued. Baptized his children, buried his first wife. He's not an evil man, just a grieving one who's let anger cloud his judgment. You think you can talk to him? Patterson asked. I think I can try. But I'd need the girl there, to tell her side of the story. That's crazy, Thompson objected. You'd be walking her right into his hands. Sometimes the direct path is the safest, Father Miguel replied. Judge Morrison is many things, but he's not a murderer. If he heard the truth from the girl herself, in a church, with witnesses. It could work, Mrs. Patterson said slowly. Man might be different when he's not hiding behind bounty hunters. Zeke looked at Ruth, who was considering the priest's words with the careful attention she gave everything important. What do you think? He asked her. I think I'm tired of running, she said simply. I think I want Caleb to grow up knowing his real name. And if the judge doesn't listen? Her smile was small but determined. Then at least we tried the right way first. The decision made, they changed course. Instead of continuing west toward California, they turned south toward Santa Fe and the confrontation that would determine their futures. The wagon train reached Santa Fe on a dusty Thursday afternoon, when the plaza was filled with merchants and travelers from across the territory. It was a larger town than Ruth had ever seen, adobe buildings 2 and 3 stories tall, church bells ringing the hour, the air filled with the sounds of commerce and conversation in 3 languages. Father Miguel had ridden ahead to make arrangements. He met them at the edge of town, his face grave but determined. Judge Morrison has agreed to meet, he reported. Tomorrow morning, in the church. He'll bring his sheriff, but no bounty hunters. Can we trust him? Zeke asked. We'll find out. They spent the night in a small hotel near the plaza, Ruth and Caleb sharing one room, Zeke in another. None of them slept well. Outside their windows, Santa Fe lived its nighttime life, music from cantinas, the clip-clop of late horses, the sound of men who might be friends or enemies planning whatever men planned in such places. Morning came too soon. Father Miguel called for them just after sunrise, leading them through narrow streets to a small adobe church with a bell tower that seemed to touch the sky. Judge Morrison was waiting inside, a tall man with silver hair and hard eyes that looked like his dead brothers. Sheriff Valdez stood beside him, hand resting casually on his gun butt. This is her? The judge asked, looking at Ruth with undisguised hatred. This is Ruth Morales, Father Miguel said gently. And her brother Caleb, and Sergeant Washington who has been protecting them. Protecting a murderess. Protecting a child who defended herself from assault, the priest corrected. Perhaps we should hear her story before passing judgment. Judge Morrison's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. Speak. Ruth stepped forward, her spine straight despite the fear Zeke could see trembling in her hands. Caleb clung to her skirt, wide eyes moving between the adults whose words would decide his sister's fate. "Your Honor," Ruth began, her voice clear in the church's vaulted space. "My name is Ruth Elena Morales. I am 13 years old. Last spring, my mother died of fever. My father was already dead, killed in a cattle drive accident. My brother and I had nothing, no money, no food, nowhere to go." The judge listened without expression, but Zeke noticed his hands had stopped clenching and unclenching. "I went to your brother's store in Mesilla," Ruth continued. "I begged him for work, anything so we could eat. He said he would help, but when I brought Caleb to the store, Mr. Morrison locked the door behind us." "Lies," the judge said, but his voice lacked conviction. "He told me I could work upstairs in his private rooms. But Caleb had to stay in the storeroom. I knew what he meant, Your Honor. I may be young, but I'm not stupid." Ruth's voice grew stronger as she spoke, the truth lending power to her words. "I told him no. I said we would find another way. But he grabbed me, said I didn't have a choice. Said no one would believe a Mexican girl over a respected businessman." Judge Morrison's face had gone very pale. "I reached for the first thing I could find, a knife from his counter. I only meant to make him let go of me. But he was angry, and when he lunged forward..." Ruth's voice broke slightly. "The knife went into his belly. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop." The church was silent except for the distant sound of bells from the plaza. Finally, Judge Morrison spoke. "You expect me to believe my brother was a rapist? I expect you to remember what kind of man he really was," Father Miguel said quietly. "You buried 2 wives, Judge. Both of them bruised when they died. Both of them afraid to speak against their husband." The words hit like thunder. Judge Morrison staggered as if struck, his face cycling through denial, rage, and finally, terrible understanding. "No," he whispered. "Samuel wasn't, he wouldn't." "You know he would," the priest said gently. "In your heart, you've always known." The judge aged 10 years in as many seconds. His shoulders sagged, his hand went to his chest as if his heart was breaking all over again. "God forgive me," he said finally. "What have I done?" Sheriff Valdez looked between the judge and the girl, his own understanding dawning. "Judge? What are your orders?" Morrison looked at Ruth for a long moment, really looked, seeing perhaps for the first time not a murderess but a child who had fought for her life and her brother's safety. "Drop the charges," he said quietly. "All of them." "Sir?" "You heard me, Valdez. There are no charges against this girl. The bounty is rescinded, effective immediately." Ruth's knees buckled with relief. Zeke caught her before she could fall, his strong arms steadying her as she wept for the first time since her mother's death. "Thank you," she whispered to the judge. "Thank you for listening." Judge Morrison nodded stiffly, then walked out of the church without another word. They could hear him outside, giving orders to his sheriff, sending riders to spread word that the bounty on Ruth Morales was no more. Father Miguel smiled, the first genuine happiness they'd seen from him since they met. "It is finished," he said simply. But Zeke knew it wasn't finished. Not really. The bounty hunters who'd followed them didn't know about the judge's change of heart. Word would take time to spread, and in the meantime, dangerous men were still hunting a girl they thought was worth $500. They needed to disappear until the news could travel, needed to find a place where Ruth and Caleb could start over without looking over their shoulders. "Father," Zeke said, "you mentioned a mission you were starting. Where?" "North of here in the mountains. A small valley with good water and fertile ground." "Why?" "Sounds like a good place for a new beginning." The priests studied their faces, Ruth still tear-streaked but smiling, Caleb clinging to his sister, Zeke standing protective over both of them. "It would be," he agreed. "A very good place indeed." 2 days later, they rode north out of Santa Fe with Father Miguel, following a trail that climbed steadily into the mountains. The wagon train had continued west without them, but not before heartfelt farewells and promises to write. Mrs. Patterson had hugged Ruth like her own granddaughter. "You remember what I taught you about cooking," she said. And remember that being strong don't mean you can't be happy too. Patterson had shaken Zeke's hand with genuine respect. You ever get tired of mountain life? There's always room for a good man in Oregon territory. The trail to the mission was beautiful in a way that made Ruth gasp with wonder. Pine forests gave way to meadows filled with wildflowers. Streams ran clear and cold, nothing like the precious, muddy water of the desert. The air was thin but clean, carrying the scent of snow and growing things. On their second day of travel, Caleb spoke his first complete sentence. "Ruth, look at the pretty flowers." Father Miguel laughed with delight. "The mountains are good for the soul," he said, "and apparently good for the voice as well." They reached the mission site on a warm afternoon when the sun slanted through the pines like cathedral light. It was a small valley, maybe 2 miles long and half as wide, with a stream running down its center and good grazing land on the slopes. The remains of an old trading post stood near the stream, solid log construction that could be repaired and expanded. "This is it?" Ruth asked, looking around in wonder. "This is it," Father Miguel confirmed. "What do you think?" Ruth walked to the stream and knelt beside it, cupping the clear water in her hands. Caleb joined her, laughing as minnows darted between his fingers. "I think," Ruth said slowly, "it's the most beautiful place I've ever seen." Zeke dismounted and walked the perimeter of the clearing, his soldiers' eye cataloging defensive positions, water sources, fields that could be planted. It was good land, isolated enough to be safe but accessible enough to trade with the outside world when necessary. "There's work to be done," he said finally. "Lots of it." "Good thing we like to work," Ruth replied, grinning at him. That night, they camped beside the stream under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Father Miguel said evening prayers in Latin while Ruth hummed a Spanish lullaby to Caleb. Zeke sat apart, as was his custom, but not as far apart as he once had. "Sergeant," Ruth called softly. "Yes. Do you think we'll be happy here?" He looked at her in the firelight, no longer the desperate, dust-covered girl who'd knocked on his door, but still carrying that same core of steel that had impressed him from the beginning. "I think we'll have a chance to be," he said. "Maybe that's enough to start with." She smiled and settled back against her saddle, Caleb curled beside her like a sleeping puppy. Zeke stayed awake long after the others slept, listening to the night sounds of the mountains, so different from the desert's harsh whispers. An owl called from the darkness. The stream gurgled over stones. Ruth murmured something in her sleep, and Caleb answered with a soft sigh. For the first time in 20 years, Ezekiel Washington allowed himself to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. The mission grew slowly. Father Miguel proved to be as handy with hammer and saw as he was with prayer book and Latin. Zeke's military engineering skills served them well in planning the layout of buildings and defensive positions. But it was Ruth who truly made the place come alive. She planted a kitchen garden that flourished in the mountain soil. She organized the storage of supplies and the rationing of food through the winter. She taught Caleb his letters using pages from Father Miguel's books, and when other families began to trickle in, drawn by word of a safe haven in the mountains, she helped the women establish a school. By the first anniversary of their arrival, the mission supported 15 families. There was a church, a school, a blacksmith shop, and plans for a sawmill the following spring. Children played in the meadows where Ruth and Caleb had first seen the minnows in the stream. Zeke had become, without anyone officially appointing him, the settlement's protector and guide. When traders needed escort through dangerous country, they hired him. When territorial officials needed someone to negotiate with Apache bands, they sent for the buffalo soldier who lived in the mountains. His reputation for fairness and straight dealing spread throughout the territory. But the real change was in the small moments. The way he smiled when Caleb proudly read a complete paragraph from the Bible. The way he and Ruth worked together in the evenings, planning the next day's tasks, comfortable in each other's company. The way he'd started keeping a journal, recording not just practical matters but his thoughts, his hopes for the future. Ruth, now 14, had grown into a young woman of remarkable capability and quiet beauty. She managed the mission's practical affairs with the same efficiency she'd once brought to keeping herself and Caleb alive in the desert. But she'd also learned to laugh, to play with the other children, to dream about possibilities instead of just survival. One evening in late summer, as they sat by the stream watching Caleb and his friends chase fireflies, Ruth asked a question that had been weighing on her mind. "Do you ever think about her? The woman in the photograph?" Zeke was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Every day. Do you think she'd approve? Of us?" He turned to look at her, this girl who'd somehow become his daughter in all but blood, who'd brought laughter and purpose back into his life. "I think," he said slowly, "she'd say I finally learned the difference between surviving and living." Ruth nodded, satisfied with that answer. Around them, the mountains settled into evening peace, and in the distance, the mission's bell tower caught the last light of day like a promise that tomorrow would come, and that they would be there to meet it together. As autumn painted the aspens gold and red, word came from the territorial capital that Judge Morrison had died quietly in his sleep, having spent his final months establishing a fund for orphan children throughout New Mexico. The last formal threat to Ruth's freedom was gone, but by then it hardly mattered. She had found something more valuable than safety. She had found home. On a crisp October morning, as the first snow dusted the high peaks, Father Miguel performed a ceremony that surprised everyone, including the participants. He officially adopted Ruth and Caleb Morales as his wards, giving them not just protection but family name and legal standing. But the real surprise came when Zeke asked to speak. "I've spent most of my life as a soldier," he said to the assembled community. "Following orders, fighting other people's battles, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. But these two children taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to stay, choosing to care, choosing to build something together that's bigger than any one person." He paused, looking at Ruth and Caleb with undisguised love. "If Father Miguel and the law allows it, I'd like to adopt them too. Not to replace what they've lost, but to give them another foundation to build on." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. Caleb, now 4 and full of questions, tugged on Zeke's sleeve. "Does that mean you're my papa now?" Zeke knelt to the boy's level, his weathered face soft with emotion. "If you want me to be." "I do." Caleb launched himself into Zeke's arms with the confidence of a child who knew he was loved and wanted. Ruth hugged them both, these two men who had become her anchor in a storm-tossed world. Around them, the community cheered and applauded, celebrating not just a legal formality but the triumph of love over loss, hope over despair, family chosen over family lost. As winter settled over their valley, bringing snow that turned the world into a crystalline wonderland, the mission thrived. The children learned their lessons by lamplight while wind howled outside. The adults planned improvements for the spring, shared stories around communal fires, built the bonds that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. And in a small cabin by the stream, a former Buffalo soldier read bedtime stories to his adopted children, his voice gentle with the kind of peace that comes only to those who have finally found their way home. Ruth, now 15, had become the unofficial teacher for the mission school, her quick mind and patient nature making her beloved by all the children. Caleb, growing tall and strong in the mountain air, showed signs of inheriting both his sister's intelligence and his adopted father's quiet strength. One evening, as spring returned to the valley and the snow began to melt into rushing streams, Zeke sat on his porch watching his children play with their friends in the meadow. Ruth was teaching the younger ones a circle game while Caleb, now 5, helped organize races between the older boys. Father Miguel joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee and settling into the second chair Zeke had built for just such occasions. "You look content," the priest observed. "I am. Any regrets about the path that brought you here?" Zeke thought about that, about the years of solitude, the battles fought, the prices paid in blood and loneliness. About a desperate girl knocking on his door in the desert heat, asking him to be her father. "No regrets," he said finally. "Sometimes the longest road turns out to be the shortest distance to where you were meant to be." In the meadow, Ruth's laughter carried on the evening breeze as Caleb tackled one of his friends in their game. The sound was pure joy, unmarked by the fear and desperation that had once defined their lives. Zeke smiled, sipped his coffee, and watched his children play in the dying light, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, New chances to build the life they'd chosen together. The Buffalo Soldier had finally come home.